I used to throw a little bit of my own little spin to the story.
I have every Old Testament motif that's in the New Testament. I got it.
They're grinding and torturing them and ripping their flesh off and all this stuff.
These idiots around me are talking to stone idols, thinking they're gods.
Right.
This is not God.
It's so superstitious in a way.
Come out of nowhere and start some new thing. They were a part of an evolution.
No, dude. This is exactly what you guys are pretty much doing in saying Jesus' death. Gnostic Informant here with Mythvision podcast. This should be a good one. You and I, as devout Christians, would look to this Abrahamic story where Abraham was promised to, be the father of many nations. And of course, he goes to sacrifice Isaac. And I used to throw a little bit of my own little spin to the story and be like, oh, and he replaced it with a lamb. The story says a ram, but I would say a lamb. And guess what? It was the Lamb of God, which was the foretelling of Jesus' sacrifice. And Christians,
also, Isaac carried his own wood, just like Jesus carried his own cross.
Right. And
I have every Old Testament motif that's in the New Testament. I got it. I was there. I remember being that guy, ready to tell everyone about all that stuff.
And you sometimes a little tweak it just to really emphasize Jesus into it and stuff. But the point is there is a reoccurring mythical theme, not only from Abraham to Jesus, but that's when you're just looking at the Bible. We're going beyond. And I think it's interesting to note that you have found a source, and it wasn't just you, but it's you're really bringing this forward. I think this is powerful because I just did that video on Phrixus and Isaac, trying to give you the origins of Abraham's myth. And there is a comparison between Phrixus, which is the son of Menanthus. I think it's pronounced Menanthus. He was the king who was promised a great land, just like Abraham was promised to be a great nation, okay?
Right.
And it's his long foretelling descendants who will then get that land. But in the meantime, his wife, their stepmother, hated them and tricked the dad, said, hey, Apollo, through the oracle at Delphi, said, you need to sacrifice your son, Phrixus, and Helle, or Helene, however you pronounce that. And he goes to do it, and a golden fleeced ram comes and saves them from being killed by the father. Sacrificed, and a deity sacrificial human sacrifice to this god. We love to go to the ancient Near East and see that at one point they did human sacrifice.
And they also have, in this city of Ur, have dug up a golden ram in a thicket. And that's where Abraham's from.
Yeah.
And they found that there. So it's there's a lot of stuff happening with this ram thing, but go ahead.
I love what you're saying there because it ties into kind of the whole Tower of Babel myth. I talk about this and I'm like, okay, we know that this is clearly mythological. In Genesis 1-11, scholars have recognized this. I'd go beyond that. I think the whole book of Genesis is mythological in nature. But they want to look at it, and some scholars are saying maybe people who traveled through the region of Mesopotamia at the time, maybe these authors, maybe Jews in exile or post-exile in the Persian era, they may have seen an abandoned, collapsed ziggurat. Okay, so if you and me were walking, we go, let's say we decide we're going to go over there to Iraq and see some of these locations. We're going to see abandoned ancient sites, right? Well, in their day, they were abandoned and ancient. So here they are creating a myth around this geographical spot with this tradition saying, see this massive building, the ziggurat? This was the tower to heaven. And guess what? It wasn't completed. You can see it's stopped in its halt. It's not completed. The myth of the Tower of Babel, some scholars think, is surrounding this particular abandoned building, and the mythos surrounding it is there. So my point about you saying this about the ram in a thicket in Ur is we know this is in the Greek myths. We know this is in the biblical myths. I think they're later. Some scholars think they're earlier. I think Hellenistic.
And the Greeks, it seems, were the best at preserving the knowledge that came from the ancients through not only the people that, who they call the Proto-Greeks, like the Pelasgians, but also through the Hittites.
Right.
And the Hittites were writing in cuneiform, and they're connected to the world of Babylon. So that stuff is getting brought over to the Greeks.
Dude, Berosus. They would pay. They would hire the best of the best from all of the regions to just put it into their common language and Hellenize it.
Yes.
That's literally their job.
The stories of Pythagoras, the stories of Heraclitus, always would say they spent time in Babylon, they spent time in Egypt, and they're bringing this knowledge back to these Greeks. And so I guess what we're both trying to say is the Greek world and the Babylonian or Egyptian world, which in between that you have Israel, there's no fence off happening.
No.
This is a world that everything's connected.
They're all talking, and the myths are also
overlapping.
So this is where you discovered something, Neil, that when I first heard you say it, I'm like, dude, sometimes you wonder, like,
I gotta check it for myself. This sounds too good to be true.
I was just about to say, like, Neil, where did you pull this shit up? I'm not gonna lie, like,
right.
Bro, you pulled this out of your ass, like, and then you're like, no, bro, I found a document that has really good reasons that I was so skeptical even from the start, like even as you were showing me, and you were like, that shows this very old thing that looks like Abraham, has circumcision, has the sacrifice of an only begotten son, all of this stuff, and it's ancient.
You have the god El.
So tell us, who wrote about this?
So it's the same God that Abraham is worshiping, but he's doing the stuff. So first, let me tell him what's going on.
Let's talk about this, yeah.
Okay. Eusebius was a great historian. I don't care what you think about him.
He may have fudged stuff, but the guy really tried.
He was a real historian.
Right.
So if you ever read his text called on the preparation for the gospel, it is filled with citations of ancient sources. Every page is littered. If you really like ancient history and you haven't read that yet, that should be your next. Go do that next, because it's filled with knowledge, right. And he's just preserving text that he feels. Eusebius. Here's what he's doing in this text. This matters to what I'm getting.
Yeah,
at.
What's the context, right?
What Eusebius is doing is he's looking at the ancient world, and he's saying what led up to Jesus. Like what is because we know people in the time of Eusebius all knew that the Old Testament points to Jesus. You know, it
was accepted Christian.
Well, you and I know that these are great authors who are drawing from the Old Testament, like Isaac carrying the wood.
Right.
This is great literary motifs being drawn from.
Yeah.
As a believer, like Eusebius and other, they're thinking that these are prophecies pointing to Christ.
I need to add one caveat to this point that you're making that's so powerful, Neil. Yeah. You got the whole obvious. When I read my King James Bible a long time ago, it says the Old Testament is the New Testament concealed. The New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. But here's what's powerful. By the 4th century, when Eusebius is writing his wonderful historiographical work, and he says, like, I've tried to find, this is where Richard C. Miller comes in and goes, dude, the first historian in the Christian church is Eusebius. Yeah. No one before that was writing histories or historiography.
He does a good job.
But this is the powerful point. Justin Martyr, very early on, had to deal with this very difficult thing. You and me have been trying to tell Michael Jones.
The philosophy side.
Bro, not just the philosophy, but the comparative mythology side, because Michael Jones and all these guys are trying to ignore this and don't want to see.
Okay, real quick.
You get where this is going.
The difference between Eusebius and Justin Martyr is Eusebius is part of a world that's becoming Christianized, and he doesn't really have to worry about duking it out with the pagans. Right. That work's been done by Justin Martyr and Irenaeus.
Yes.
Now, Justin Martyr is living in a pagan world where Christianity is looked down at, and he has to duke it out philosophically with these guys. He has to deal with it. He has no choice but to say, yeah, Mercury is also called the Logos. Yeah. Mercury is also the son of God.
Asclepius, sure. Hercules, sure.
Yes, he has no choice but to deal with those texts.
Because it's obvious.
And
so tell me if you think I'm going on the right hunch. Yes, there is this uphill battle with Justin Martyr, Origen early on and stuff like that against the pagans. By the 4th century, it's not an uphill battle, but because he's already, like, it's Eusebius is reading the Fathers.
This is in 325 when Eusebius is writing this.
So he already accepts the notion there's comparisons.
Right.
He sees that the mythic world around is foretelling Jesus.
You just walk right into what I was going to, my point. So Eusebius is not only saying, yeah, the old prophets of Isaiah and the Genesis stuff points to Jesus. he's saying, but what if it's also the Greek stuff? What if it's also the Phoenician stuff? What if it's also Egyptian stuff?
The world.
What if it's Babylonian? He is going everywhere, pointing to mythologies, pointing to philosophies, pointing to Zoroaster, pointing to this guy, pointing to this guy, and he's just filling in quotes and citations, and he's saying this points to Jesus because of this. Now, that's the text that is called
Origins, the Gospel,
preparation for the gospel.
Right.
Preparatio Evangelical is in the Latin, or Greek, or Latin. This text is it opens up. This is in the very beginning, chapter 1, book 1. He starts off with the Phoenicians. He wants to go back to the beginning. He's going back before Israel is even a thing. He cites a guy named Philo of Byblos who lived in the 1st century.
So from 4th century to 1st century.
But the text that he's citing from Philo of Byblos also cites a Bronze Age priest. I always get this name wrong. Sanko Nieton, I think it is.
Yeah.
Sanko Nieton.
Something like that.
But I put the name on the screen for you. Supposedly this guy lived right before that collapse of the Bronze Age, and his texts survived in temples in Byblos. That's why Philo of Byblos had access to this. Now, you don't have to believe it or not. Some people believe it, some people don't. In fact, I checked.
this is
I
good.
checked that what the scholarly consensus is. I actually thought the scholarly consensus is that this is
he made it
this
up.
is all made up.
Right.
But in fact, the scholarly consensus is that the sources, or the Philo of Byblos citation, seems legit. It seems like he Hellenized an actual text, because the names of the gods that are in this text, it's a huge theogony.
Yeah.
By the way, a theogony is like if you know Hesiod's theogony, it's basically like a story of how the world came about, how the gods came about, the birth of the gods, right? Mm-hmm. So this is a big Phoenician theogony. And they mention, and the scholarly consensus is, well, Philo of Byblos seems to know a lot of these ancient Bronze Age gods that were forgotten about in his time.
So and just to add to that,
he wouldn't have known about these gods.
This is a powerful
unless
point.
he had an access to a source that actually went back this far.
So imagine a 1st century author named Philo of Byblos getting mentioned by a guy named Eusebius, who's very popular, and for 2,000 years almost, 1,700 years, we're sitting here going, and then we get into this post-Enlightenment skeptical age, and then all of a sudden we go to the actual Phoenician regions, we find the names of these deities, which have been Hellenized.
That's what happened. Archaeology sort of vindicated Eusebius
on this point.
On this one point, that these gods are Bronze Age gods.
Right.
Okay. With that being said, I have to throw this out there, but someone's going to get mad at me if I don't. The text has a euhemerus slant. That shows that this has to be post-Hellenization period. Right. Euhemerus coming from that period. So, Philo of Byblos, this is what the scholarly consensus is. Philo of Byblos had a text. He used it as a source, but he wrote his own news story. He didn't copy it word for word. He Hellenized and euhemerized probably maybe one source or multiple sources. Who knows? All we know is what Philo of Byblos wrote down is a 1st century text using sources that legitimately could go back to the Bronze Age.
And he could understand this language. So you understand
Phoenician.
He understands the ancient Phoenician language, just like Berosus could decipher the ancient, or Manetho could decipher the Egyptian
comparison.
Right.
Philo of Byblos is the Phoenician version of Manetho and Berosus.
Right.
For Egypt and Babylon.
Right. Manetho would have been Egyptian hieroglyphic, and Berosus would have been the Akkadian and the Babylonian and all that. Here you have a guy, Phoenician, doing the same thing just a few centuries after these people. And he Hellenized.
That is the perfect comparison.
Right.
It's exactly.
But they also Hellenized the ancient Babylonian.
Exactly. Just like Berosus Hellenizes the Chaldean stuff.
Right. But we don't throw them out and say,
no, we don't throw them out. We know that Chaldean, we know that when Berosus mentions this god named, not just Inanna, but what's
Kisithros. There's another guy named,
remember that one he mentions the god that comes out of the water, Oannes. He mentions these gods, Oannes, and this is all he's writing in Greek in the 3rd century. But it turns out that is Bronze Age stuff.
Right.
So there's no so the scholarly consensus, there's no reason to think that Philo isn't doing something similar to this.
We're actually building up to a point, and you're going to see why.
Okay. Now that we have to lay that out first.
We had to.
So now you're asking, what's this text?
What is this?
Now that we know what the scholars think about it,
what
it
does
is,
Eusebius tell us?
So the text is about, it opens up. This is, by the way, all this text leading up to Jesus, he starts off in Phoenicia with a text called the Phoenician History by Sancho Niethen. And the story is El, who is equated with Saturn or Kronos. That's Philo of Byblos saying this.
Right.
Philo of Byblos is looking at a text that has El in it.
Elios or
well, in Greek it's Elus.
Right, Elus.
The US is just the
right.
end of a Greek. That's how you Greek. That's
But
how you
it's
Hellenize. It's El.
Got it.
It's the god El. It's the Canaanite god El.
Ugaritic El.
And and by the way, there's no other god named El. Well, it just means God.
Let's tell our audience this too.
Yeah.
Phoenicians are
Semitic.
more future Canaanites. So you have the Canaanites.
It's the same people.
Same people, but you have this Bronze Age pre, which you would call Canaanite, and then you have Bronze Age post, and you could call
In fact,
those
they don't
Phoenicians.
call themselves Phoenicians. That's what the Greeks call them.
Right.
So they are Canaanites.
So they're just Canaanites that just...
Yes.
Okay.
They're the purple people.
We're on the same page.
Okay.
Isn't it weird that these Canaanite Israelites ends up having this Abraham story? And
right.
Oh, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself.
So here, listen to this. El, who Philo says, who we call Kronos or Saturn, sacrifices his only he says he arrayed his son in holy attire and put him on the altar and sacrificed his only begotten son. Those are the literal words he uses.
That's exactly
sacrifices his only begotten son to his father Aranos, which is heaven in Greek. But he actually does the sacrifice. There's nothing stopping him.
Nothing stopping. And that's why in Jewish lore, I think Abraham does kill Isaac.
Right.
But
which actually makes you think this is older, because there is a Hebrew scholar, and I just forgot his name, Shucks, I wish I remembered it. Simca interviewed him, and this guy said that there was a time in ancient Canaanite history where sacrificing a firstborn would have probably been happening.
oh no, there's several. Kipp Davis, Matthew Munger. We also got
so this is going back to that.
Right.
So El sacrifices his only begotten son to Aranos as an offering.
And real quick on the Greek side, just to give them,
but there's more.
I want us to take this piece by piece, because you're mentioning names Saturn, which is Kronos, you can say, or at least they have correlation, because Saturn ends up being a son of Kronos.
And by the way, the Sabbath is on Saturn's day. Might be something there too.
In that myth, you also have Kronos eating his children, or going to kill he's trying to kill his children. So there's a sacrifice taking place here. I just want to mention that, because why would he Hellenize it and make that the deity? Well, look, you got a god killing a son. You got a god killing a son in the Greek one. Is it because they were two disparate myths, or is it because there's a common source?
But before we get to the Abraham thing, so right now you're probably thinking, okay, that is interesting. There's a big difference, though. Abraham doesn't actually kill his son. Where's the golden ram at? All that stuff's a good question. Here's what makes it more... makes you think Abraham. Because in a couple of passages later, El circumcises himself and makes it a right for all males on their 8th day to be circumcised from this point forward, that everybody from the Phoenician clan had to do this.
Right.
Who in the Bible, it's Abraham that does that. It's not Isaac, it's not Jacob, it's not Moses. It's Abraham who starts the circumcision rite.
Right.
So now you have, if it was just the sacrificing his only son thing, that might not be enough.
Right.
But when you combine sacrificing your only son with this is a very specific thing, circumcision. This isn't just happen. It's not like everyone in the world just randomly doing this. You have two different distinct things happening in the text. Sacrificing his only son and then circumcising himself.
Right.
Then now you're looking at a text that is passed down in the same geographic area, in a Semitic language, with the same god El.
So you have a Semitic language, same god El, which is found in the Bible and in this. You've got
Well,
circumcision.
Abraham's sacrificing for El sacrificing for heaven.
Right.
So it is kind of weird. It's
It
like
is
there's
a little bit different.
succession happening
Well,
there.
we've talked about this whole succession of deities too, and I don't want to rabbit trail, but the idea that Yahweh is a descendant or one of the sons in the theogony of the biblical text, it's kind of there, but it doesn't spell it out clear because they want to. There seems later that all of this material is coming together in the Hellenistic age, but it seems like Yahweh is a descendant of El. But I've asked the question: was El a son of a god as well? And I imagine he was.
He was.
So here you have this ancient Phoenician, ancient Canaanite, and all scholars consensus say the ancient Israelites were Canaanites. So we have the source, and here's Eusebius in the 4th century AD after Jesus trying to reach back, building up, and this means he's cooperating with the idea of the Greek myths also having.
So he gives his commentary on this text. He doesn't just write it and just leave it there.
Yeah.
He gives his commentary. He says he has a commentary on this text. He doesn't just tell you the story and then move on to the next story. He gives his own opinion on why he's adding this to the preparation of the gospel. So what Eusebius says is, such then is the character of the theology of the Phoenicians, from which the word of would be the logos of salvation in the gospel teaches us to flee with averted eyes and earnestly seek the remedy for this madness of the ancients. It must be manifest that these are not fables and poets' fictions containing some theory concealed in hidden meanings, but true testimonies, as they would assume themselves of wise and ancient theologians, containing things of earlier date than all poets and historians, and deriving the credibility of their statements from the names and history of the gods still prevailing in the cities and villages of Phoenicia, and from the mystery celebrated among each people, so that it is no longer necessary to seek out violent physical explanations of these, since the evidence which the facts bring up with them of themselves is quite clear. Such then is the theology of the Phoenicians.
So real quick here, this is a really interesting
and
point.
He brings, and there's another commentary in there just above that where he says the only begotten son being sacrificed.
He goes
is
to that
is the myth of the world.
Right. And what's interesting at the beginning of his topic on this, he points out the Phoenicians and the Egyptians were the first people who brought up the deities, all this stuff, which we've now know Sumerians really played a significant part in that.
Right.
But it's really interesting point is he makes it sound like this is what actually happened. So I want to give my little commentary on this. We see the connection of him clearly making correlation to Abraham, first circumcision. We see it with the only begotten son, human sacrifice. We see this is clearly pointing to the gospel. What is the gospel? Jesus Christ crucified. But I want to take a modern stab at this and point out something. In that neck of the woods at this time, they thought that was a good idea. Many Christians today think, yeah, Jesus had to come and die on a cross and blah, blah, blah. But like we see this as mythology now.
Right. It doesn't. It's like it sounds bizarre. It sounds ancient. Like in the time period, we're not that far. We're a lot closer, I should say, to the times where sacrifice
of humans
was
real.
Something that people thought was.
They thought it was the best thing for the gods.
A real thing that's actually helping.
You even
like Greek Alexander Romance. Before he goes and battles Darius, he gets a ram or whatever, a bull, sacrifices it, checks the entrails. The priest comes and looks at it and says, "You will win this war." Right. Like that is Alexander the Great,
right? Doing
this, like this is.
But before that, there were times when it took a human.
Yeah.
And in fact,
right.
Yeah, it wasn't just animals.
Humans,
they needed a human, and a human was the highest version of sacrifice you could possibly give to a god or gods. And you could see this. Go check out Candida Moss's book on the myth of persecution. She goes to the Greek world, and I can't remember the woman that they ended up sacrificing, but the king in Troy, I think it was Troy, one of these cities ends up promising the gods the sacrifice of his daughter. She comes thinking, he calls to her and his wife thinking she's coming to marry like Achilles. Turns out, no, at the last second he says, "I'm sorry, but I promise to sacrifice you to the gods. She then turns around in the narrative after everybody cries and mourns her death because she would never be married and have children and stuff. Then she says, Father, do what you promised the gods. Kind of like what we see in the book of Judges, where you have this promise to El that, he's going, or Yahweh, I can't remember which deity particularly in there, but he promises his daughter, he promises whoever walks through the doorpost, his daughter walks through and goes, you have undone me. Then he has to sacrifice her. She says, just give me 1 month to mourn my virginity, and then you can do what you got to do. Like, that was common. And I guess what I'm getting at is, from an ethical modern standpoint, I'm not judging the ancients.
Right.
I'm making a point. Can you imagine literally today thinking this is the literal truth, and you're talking about killing a human being as your sacrifice? Like, look, I'm trying to make a point.
It's wild.
Trying to make a point, yeah. And the fact that they have a sacrifice yourself or human sacrifice as like a real
It reminds me
thing.
of that meme where they were like, we need a virgin for the sacrifice.
Right.
And all of a sudden, everybody's just a huge slut. Like, oh, yeah, it ain't me. I just got like 10 dudes last night.
Yeah. Like, it's just funny that you can see this is dated. And why aren't we looking at this as mythology? Chronos and El?
Do you realize how much of a good point you just made? Because even I think a modern Christian today would probably think those stuff is dated. But wait a minute.
Yeah, your whole theology.
Your whole theology, and Eusebius points this out very clearly.
Yes.
Is
rooted in ancient
rooted in
Canaanite.
The sacrifice for your sins comes from this type of stuff. Like, you can't sit there and call other things dated unless.
So look at I wish we had a Christian, reaction. Yeah. All right, watch this. We pull up that show, Apocalypto, right? That movie, my favorite little Indian we call it Indian, but you know what I mean. Apocalypto with the Native Americans and what happened when Mel Gibson did that. And then you see them carve the heart trying to get the solar eclipse to happen on the top of the Mayan temple. You have this pyramid. And they literally, kill human sacrifice, right? And they go, how archaic, barbaric. No, dude. This is exactly what you guys are pretty much doing in saying Jesus' death is the human sacrifice that appeased my wrathful, vengeful God who's going to take it out on me.
It's so true.
It's so primitive.
Yeah. Because, look, we started this off. This is coming back full circle perfectly.
Yeah, it is.
We started this off talking about how the Old Testament points to the New. We know that's the great author, by the way.
Yes.
Drawing back from this Old Testament and making this story about Jesus. Well, they're drawing the concepts of the burnt offering to the Lord, the Passover meal, right? The Yom Kippur sacrifice for the sins. Those are the concepts that are being placed on a Jesus. And Christians don't do those things today because the last sacrifice is the last, that's all. But that doesn't mean, so what you're saying is, all that stuff is real and valid, and you're saying it's working, but Jesus replaces that.
Right.
So it's like, are you not saying this is primitive? Because I don't know where you're at with that. Like,
it's very.
I don't know if that made sense or not.
That's why I said if they looked at Mayans doing this 400, 500 years ago on pyramids in South America, and they go, "What barbaric kind of people is?"
Well,
this?
I've even heard Christians say Jesus put an end to all this, archaic nonsense of burnt offerings. Why did they have to do it then?
Yeah.
Why did God like it so much? That's the God. You're saying God's ideas aren't good? You're saying God had to change his mind?
From day one, human sacrifice.
What are you saying? What are we saying here?
And we see elements left over in the Deuteronomic law and other places in the Bible where the firstborn child, you're supposed to give the firstborn son as an offering to the Lord. It literally says as an offering to the Lord. Here's the thing though. You see them change this because in the same context, it talks about your firstborn male bull, your firstborn male sheep. Like, what does that mean? That meant sacrifice them. But instead, they found a way where they could pay for the firstborn male. They could give here's in replacement of my son, here's some money to the priest and to the temple and to the cult so that they don't have to kill them anymore because they probably started going, hey, this is not, but like
we're wasting resources.
We're killing our kids.
Right.
And maybe their ethics and moral compass is starting to change.
Yeah.
So then you come up with this like, all right, we're not going to purposefully go out of our way to kill a human, but this is like the perfect example to say he got killed, but that was all part of the plan. So God actually took it out on his son kind of thing. Does that make sense? So they took a real death of a person, mythologized it into their theology that roots way back into human sacrifice. And it's just this continuing mythos, like Levi Strauss. We did the edit. You and me edited this Phrixus comparison to Isaac in the Bible. He says, no myth is the authentic thing. They're all transitional things between each culture and context. And so here you have this myth that just continues to live on. And I'm trying to say, can you not see the expiration date on this? Why are you still living thinking there's magic in the blood? The Bible talks about this as well. When Josiah goes to do the reform and kills all the priests, he sacrifices the priest on the altars that are in the wrong locations. And there's other places where they sacrifice these people and the blood of them wards off the enemies from coming. They think that it's really magic that really is doing stuff. Do you, Mr. Christian, do you, my friends today who believe Jesus' sacrifice is really the thing, think that blood carries magic in it?
Nah, and this is going to get a little in the weeds, but I just want to point this out. Because during the time during the first century, there was the ongoing debate between the atomists, the naturalist types, the people who follow Epicurean types, and the Platonists. Middle Platonists was at this time period. Middle Platonists were a little more stoic than the regular Platonists at the time period. But these are the two thought processes happening, and Christian theology is drawing heavily and hoping heavily that Plato's right, and that there are forms, and that way magic, all this stuff. Because if the atomists are right, and everything's all atoms and void, is there a heaven? Is there a hell? Because where everything's, this is it right now. Like Nietzsche says, this is it right now. There is no other. Like this is my point I'm making is, if they knew what we knew today, would this all still make sense? Would this all still get written the same way?
Exactly. I mean,
because they had different knowledge back then.
I mean, imagine your once for all belief goes back to an ancient time where humans actually killed other humans. Why? Because they honestly believed at that time that a god or gods would not give them crops, would not bring their fortunes, would not give them health, would not give them wealth, unless you gave them blood from your child, the greatest thing you could humanly have, to that god or gods, to appease it, so the cyclical cycle of agricultural mythology that they have built into their whole life can continue. The wheel of time will not keep moving until the blood of a sacrifice happens. Can you imagine?
It's funny because Eratosthenes talks about how there are people who understood like weather patterns and how to see if rain's coming, and they would use that as a weapon against society. And Eratosthenes and hygienists and these writers were just putting this on the paper for knowledge, for people to learn. Like, look, this time of the year is when it rains a lot. This time of the year, or this is how you know when a lunar eclipse can come. And like some people who knew that knowledge would say, if there's an eclipse tomorrow, I need you to take your army and leave, because that means God is going to kill you all. And then sure enough, the eclipse happens. Oh my God, he's right. We have to leave.
Yeah.
And then you won that battle with your knowledge. That was like, so that's what I'm saying. That knowledge could be either used, but basically what I'm getting at is like, the knowledge is like, either if you don't have it, you'll think it's magic. But if you do have it, everything just makes sense because it's all just a process of nature.
And
isn't that funny how that works?
It is. And Christians are in this special position because they don't have to keep watching a sacrifice necessarily.
Even in Byzantine times, when the Byzantines were being conquered by the Ottomans, 1453, Constantinople, the last week of Rome's existence, there was a blood red moon. And in the Sibylline oracles, the Christian text, it said, when there's a blood red moon, Rome will fall. Everybody fled. The armies gave up. They lost the war because of this.
It's superstition, yeah.
Because of a superstition.
And this is the blood
And they
thing.
thought it was because of the moon, but they didn't realize that if they would have fought, they probably could have kept the city. I'm not saying they would have won, they probably were losing anyway, but still.
Yeah, they're like, yo, let's just keep our lives.
Exactly.
It's interesting. That goes into the whole point of like this whole Jesus sacrifice thing. And they're in this weird predicament because while a lot of Protestant Christians today don't see the self martyrdom mentality as necessary. They have the once saved, live your life, do whatever you want kind of thing, but I can be saved. Or they might have a works-based kind of theology that's not as once saved. My point is they don't see that the participation of martyrdom is necessary. The early Christians did not say Jesus' death was it, and thank you for dying on my behalf. Hallelujah, I can live my life and just worship you and be a good person, and that's it. No.
That's a new thing.
They were martyrs. Go read Irenaeus' letter to the Romans when he's actually going to die. Not Irenaeus. Ignatius.
Yeah,
sorry.
Ignatius, yeah.
Oh, it's
Very
the
early
most suicidal
Yeah.
I've ever read of any Christian
That's how
in my whole
that's how
life.
the earliest Christians were. And even if you didn't go and martyr yourself right away, you did drop out of society immediately.
Well,
you
yeah.
were not working for the king or joining you were sitting on a pillar.
You talking about the monks and
Yeah,
different
this is what the
versions?
early Christians they were dropping out of society or beginning or martyring. It was
Right, there's weird
It was
stuff.
not a good when they became Romanized. They made it better for society.
Well, Candida Moss talked about how
Yeah.
they literally tried to go to the Roman government and said, kill us. They wanted
They wanted to be martyred.
And so this is an interesting point because Jesus' death wasn't all. Paul writes in his letters, he says, I fill up. Now, I don't know if this was his authentic letter. It doesn't matter. The theology's there in Paul's name. I'm filling up with the wounds because he just got talked about. I've been whipped 39 times. I get beaten. I did this. I've been stoned. I've had shipwrecks. He says, the wounds I'm inflicted are filling up, he says this, or the author of this text, what was lacking in the death of Christ. So Jesus, bro, he is not done. The martyrdom had to keep going. Christians had to keep dying.
Just like you get the author of James saying, anyone can have faith. Even demons have faith.
Right.
Who cares about faith? Do work you're right. Early on, there were still other aspects of salvation and besides just believing in Jesus dying.
It's almost like the most we talked about nihilism yesterday in brief.
Yeah.
But take that for example and apply it to a circumstance where no matter what you're losing in. The Maccabees, the way they narrated the Maccabees when the brothers get killed, the 7 brothers, like they're grinding and torturing them and ripping their flesh off and all this stuff. And they're just saying, you know what, let this be as a sacrifice for the nation to bring goodwill. Like it's so superstitious in a way. And
wow.
You did your Etruscan video. Remember the entrail object that literally in each section inside of the stomach, if the bowels are over here, whatever it means this. I'm saying
Harospice, yeah.
This whole thing is dated and old.
But okay, I'm sorry to cut you off.
No, go ahead, please.
The funny part about it is that Christianity was seen as a step in the direction of being more rational.
Right.
Because it was actually some of these, I'm not going to not all of them, but some of the certain ancient sites of certain temples where those Roman priests, the augurs are looking at birds flying around in the air and lightning. If the lightning went this way, it meant something. If the bird flies that way, it meant something.
Yeah.
That's not part of Christianity.
No.
Those type of things fall away. But the point I'm making is even Christianity, with how superstitious it can be, is a step in the direction of rationalism.
Yeah, but it's
because
insanity.
of what the Epicureans did.
But
I think that's what I think. By the way, a lot of Epicureans were preserved by Christians.
Right.
They were looking at the rational thinkers and taking note and okay, I get that. And they were trying to be as rational as possible.
I'm not denying that. I'm pushing back a little on this sense.
Yeah.
I agree that they were indebted from Thales on, baby.
Oh,
if it weren't for the minds of the Greeks, the great minds of the philosophical Greeks that we know of, the famous Aristotle, Plato,
Heraclitus,
all of
especially.
these, and down to Demetrius, we've talked about this in previous
Zoroaster.
lives. The whole point I'm getting at is that may be rational, but these philosophers were teaching a philosophy, and I'm not talking about the Christians yet. Even they would go to their deaths, martyrs in a way for their philosophy. And so Christians, while they were heading in the direction of trying to be more rational, they were still martyr-like, insane, irrational people.
Let me say what you just said, because the martyr martyrdom being cool didn't start with Jesus.
No.
So
Before.
Zoroaster was known of, he was a magi, part of the Mithraic religion, who saw what they were doing as very superstitious, and he turned Zoroastrianism into a more dualistic, philosophical way of that religion. And that's what he was kind of known for. By the way, the Platonists love Zoroaster. Heraclitus cites Zoroaster in a bunch of his texts, and Heraclitus is one of the first people to say, these idiots around me are talking to stone idols, thinking they're gods.
Right.
This is not God. And this is considered Eastern wisdom. So
look at the prophets who go to their deaths.
Plato,
literally.
Plato's then Pythagoras saying he spent time in Egypt and Babylon, and they're pushing back on the superstitious stuff around them. But what the point I was making about the martyrdom thing, Socrates gets told drink the hemlock. He has to drink hemlock.
Right. He faces
but it's
his
not
death.
just Socrates. Aristotle. Do you know how Aristotle died? I mean, people don't talk about this. Aristotle got condemned just like Socrates did. But instead of going to trial, he told his student Theophrastus, who also gets martyred, by the way.
Right.
He told his student Theophrastus, I'm not going to go out like Socrates. So he flees and goes north and took a sword and sliced himself. But it wasn't, there's like 5 big Athenian masters who were killed or killed themselves because they were pushing back on the superstitious stuff.
Right.
Or being called atheists or importing foreign gods. And Jesus, if you look at the Talmud, what was he condemned for? Leading Israel astray, being a sorcerer, and even some of the stuff that are as in some of his sayings looks like he's pushing back on some of the superstitious stuff too.
He's at least pushing back on some silly, the kind of rituals that some of the Jewish practices were, and he's trying to get back to the true religion. He's saying, like,
why are y'all praying out loud like it means something?
That's not true religion. Go help somebody, go do something.
Exactly, and that's the type of mindset you see with Socrates and Aristotle and Zoroaster.
By the way, Rick Miller wrote about this, about the Maccabees playing an influence and all of these other philosophers. The death of Jesus in Luke is so clearly Socrates. He is literally taking the cup and drinking the cup. Remember, take this cup from me, but let your will be done. He's drinking a cup. Why did he even say that? Why did Jesus say, take this cup from me? This is Socrates. And here's the thing. People like Michael Jones who go around feeding this, I think it's absurd, idea that Christians, if it weren't for the Christians and they're the ones that came up with the morality code and that we all are building off. Listen, don't get me wrong. We're building off the backs of Christians for 2,000 years. They've mainly been dominant in the world. However, they ignore their daddies. They have acted like they came up in a vacuum, and they ignore the philosophers and the great minds that made them. It is not Christianity.
They didn't come out of nowhere and start some new thing. They were a part of an evolution, and it just turned out that that's the label that became the state code, the state name for the religion that became the Roman religion.
Bingo.
I mean,
that's it.
Even other Roman religions, you see their influences on Roman Christianity, because Roman Christianity is a whole different thing than the Christianity that you would have saw in first century Judea.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's a whole evolution that plays its roles, and it was inevitable. It was all happening one by one.
Go check out Eusebius. Take a deep dive into the ancient history. This is what me and Neil do at Gnostic Informant. Human sacrifice is dated. Neil?
You have just attained true gnosis.